You can wait ages for a bus, and then two come along at the same time. It's a quirky English phrase, but in the case of Tifa Lockhart, I feel it's rather apt, as after waiting for some time to see her reveal within the Final Fantasy VII Remake, we also got to see her reveal within Dissidia NT not too long after. But even though both of these reveals were absolutely fantastic, they've highlighted a rather interesting conundrum that now exists, and it's a conundrum that I think is worth exploring. Now, I think we can all appreciate that in the build up to this year's E3, there was a growing sense of intrigue around the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and this intrigue only became more heightened following the release of a teaser trailer during Sony's State of Play broadcast a month earlier. Within this, we got to see some new gameplay footage, and it also gave us a brief look at two prominent characters we'd not really seen yet properly, Aerith Gainsborough and Sephiroth. But outside of the promise that we would see more at E3, one of the big things that caught everyone's attention within that trailer was the not so subtle inclusion of Tifa Lockhart within the game's menu system. Her official reveal for this particular game had been long awaited, and while part of that was down to her being such a popular, iconic and complicated character, which we will hopefully delve into soon within our Origins series, it was also because people were keen to see how Square Enix would go about modifying her appearance. I'd say it's similar to the general sense of curiosity that also exists around how Square Enix will incorporate Cloud's infamous cross-dressing scene, but in the case of Tifa, it's a much more widespread topic, as how they choose to represent her within the Final Fantasy VII Remake, from the perspective of both her appearance and her personality, will have a huge impact on how people will perceive her as a character for years to come, just as it will for Cloud, Barrett, Aerith, Sephiroth, and so on. Tifa's potential reveal within the Final Fantasy VII Remake is only half the story though, as there had also been a growing expectation that Tifa would be appearing within the next wave of DLC for Dissidia NT, the persistent brawler being developed by Team Ninja. Indeed, Ichiro Hizama, the executive producer on Dissidia NT, had said that adding in previous Dissidia characters would now be a priority for them, and Tifa previously appeared within Dissidia Duodecim. Within a data mine that happened last year, Tifa also came up as one of the potential characters alongside Zack Fair that would be added into the game. It meant that going into this year's E3, it felt like there was a perfect opportunity for Square Enix to kill two birds with one stone. They could have a full reveal for Tifa within the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and then announce straight after that you could play as her within Dissidia NT. It would have been great from a marketing perspective, as it would help to tie avid fans over as they waited for the first part of the remake to release next March. But the opportunity was missed in the immediate sense, as although Square Enix did dazzle everyone around the world by showing off their new vision for Tifa within the context of the 7 remake, there was no supporting Dissidia NT announcement. That was until a few weeks after, when they announced that she would indeed be the next character to arrive in their ever-expanding roster, and my faith was somewhat restored that sometimes they do actually have a wider plan. As you'd expect, there was a whole host of excitement around both of these announcements, but at the same time, they also felt a bit disconnected to me, and that's primarily because the Tifa they revealed for Dissidia NT was based on the original version of Tifa as opposed to the remake version of Tifa. On one hand, this of course made perfect sense, as it's in keeping with the appearances of Cloud and Sephiroth within Dissidia NT. They are also based off of the original game. But they were added a long time before the Final Fantasy VII Remake was taking shape, and in the case of Tifa, it's created, or it's rather highlighted, something of a conundrum. Do they want us to look forward, or do they want us to look back? Tetsuya Nomura had previously spoken about wanting to have the original compilation of Final Fantasy VII as essentially its own thing. If you enjoyed that game, then he encouraged you to check it out, but he wanted to make sure there was no real expectation around the remake delivering the same experience. He used this as a rationale for not wanting to remaster Crisis Core or Dirge of Cerberus, as he wanted gamers to focus on their new vision for Final Fantasy VII as opposed to being cajoled by the old one. And based on this assertion, and what we know following the various announcements and interviews that took place at E3, it's clear that the reason for this is that the remake is going to be a very, very different beast. The story will follow the same base framework, yes, but outside of that, the characters will have different interactions with each other, which will lead to amended story arcs, both of which will result in an altered perception of who these characters really are. So while Tifa Lockhart in the original Final Fantasy VII will be similar to Tifa Lockhart within the 7 Remake, there will be noticeable differences, which means they will essentially be different characters. And this relates to their visual design, their development within the narrative, and it's also safe to assume their gameplay mechanics. And it means that in the wider sense, each Final Fantasy VII character moving forward will have 2 versions, their legacy version and their remake version. And that's why these announcements felt somewhat disconnected to me. They had different objectives and were misaligned. One was asking us to be excited about what their future vision of Tifa should be, while the other, which arrived almost immediately after, was then taking our attention away, asking us to essentially reminisce about how she used to be. This disconnect wasn't just apparent within these softer aspects though, as it bled out into other areas. For example, while Tetsuya Nomura, who is of course the director of the 7 Remake, spoke to Famitsu about how the internal ethics committee had asked him to restrict or bind Tifa's chest so that it didn't look unnatural during intense action sequences, Takeo Kujiraoka, the director of Dissidia NT, spoke to Famitsu about her reveal within his game and said, "I won't say what they are, but they will bounce." What's also odd about this particular situation is that Nomura will have been responsible for designing both instances of Tifa, and he also serves as the creative director for Dissidia NT, fulfilling a supervisory role. Which does pose an interesting question. Why would the ethics committee have given advice on how Tifa should be represented within the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but not insisted the same considerations be made for her representation within Dissidia NT? But perhaps that's a topic for another day. As part of each reveal, gameplay was also shown off, but again, it felt somewhat juxtaposed. Within the Final Fantasy VII Remake gameplay reveal, they showed off her more modern combat applications. This featured some nice odes to the original game through the inclusion of moves like Beat Rush and Somersault, and it felt like a natural progression. Within the Dissidia NT gameplay reveal, they also showed off similar moves, even expanding to her classic Dolphin Punch. But then they went one step further and showed off her slot reel mechanic too, something which people either seem to love or hate about her original implementation, but nonetheless are interested to see whether it will feature within the remake. Granted, these are minor differences and considerations, but they are still differences, and they served to create 2 separate narratives for what they were trying to show, and as we get closer to the remake's release, they will become more pronounced and preferences for one or the other will start to be formed. I mean, based on this particular poll at GameFAQs, we can already see that opinions are split as to which version of Tifa is actually being preferred at the moment, and this kind of thing will no doubt start to affect internal decisions about Tifa's representation moving forward. One example of this will be cameo appearances. Brave Exvius seems to go absolutely crazy with cameos and has no problem including multiple instances of a single character as shown by Cloud and Kingdom Hearts Cloud, but with many of the other games where cameos are applicable, the general rule of thumb is that they are quite limited. It's often one character per game, and one of those characters is often Cloud Strife. But let's say Hiroki Chiba has been burrowed away and he's working on a new World of Final Fantasy game. Does he include Legacy Tifa as the cameo, or Remake Tifa? Because it's unlikely he will be able to feature both. And then it will come down to him having to make a decision based on the company line, his personal preferences, or even just how popular the different versions end up becoming. And that's internal cameos, but what about external ones? It actually reminds me of an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation called Second Chances. Within that particular storyline, a copy of William Riker was created during a freak transporter phenomenon. And although they were based on the same original concept, the 2 Rikers had lives that diverged from that point, and they became independent people, something which caused a lot of tension, and even Deanna Troi was torn between which one she preferred. In the end, the Riker copy decided to change his name to Thomas Riker to avoid confusion and help people to understand that even though they did have similarities, they were unique people. Now, I'm not saying that what we've got here is quite as extreme as that, but the back-to-back announcements have highlighted an interesting situation that will no doubt have a lasting effect on the wider franchise for years to come. We just have to make sure that we treat all iterations of the characters as equal. Just as you shouldn't have a favourite child, you also shouldn't have a favourite Tifa Lockhart, as they will both surely be special in their own way. On that note, I really hope you guys don't mind us taking the time to dive into what's really a rather nuanced topic. As soon as we saw Tifa's gameplay reveal within Dissidia NT, we immediately noted how interesting it was that they decided to show off her slot reel mechanic, while choosing to omit showing or revealing whether it will be retained for the Final Fantasy VII Remake. And as we investigated further, we ended up diving down into a rabbit hole and unearthing lots of smaller considerations that we believe may end up causing a bit of a conundrum once the Final Fantasy VII Remake releases next March, and for whatever the future of the remake holds. Perhaps one easy get out of jail card they could have employed would have been to have one of Tifa's alternative outfits from Dissidia NT relate to her remake appearance, but maybe they just didn't feel comfortable doing that until the game releases, as they will no doubt be making tweaks up until launch. There's still the option to do that later down the line though, as DLC costumes are a thing that exist within that game and will no doubt be explored at some point. Either way, we hope you enjoyed the exploration of this particular topic, and if you did, please feel free to hit that like button. We'd also love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. Big thank you again to all our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course a big thanks to all of you who are watching this video right now. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.